It's Natasha N.K.O. It's now the 4th of July, 0057. In light of recent events, I think it's appropriate to continue reading from People of the Lie by M. Scott Peck. Blah, blah, blah. This is chapter 2, Toward the Psychology of Evil. It has a number of subsections. I've read a few already. Toward the Psychology of Evil, I've read Of Models and Mystery, A Life and Death Issue, The Case of Bobby and His Parents. So I'm now going to read Evil and Sin, page 77. To more fully understand Bobby's parents, to more fully understand Bobby's parents and others like them, who will be described in the next chapter, it is necessary that we first draw the distinction between evil and ordinary sin. It is not their sins per se that characterize evil people. Rather, it is the subtlety and persistence and consistency of their sins. This is because the central defect of the evil is not the sin, but the refusal to acknowledge it. Bobby's parents and the people described in the next chapter, except for their evil, are most ordinary. They live down the street, on any street. They may be rich or poor, educated or uneducated. There is little that is dramatic about them. They are not designated criminals. More often than not, there will be solid citizens, Sunday school teachers, policemen or bankers, and active in the PTA. How can this be? How can they be evil and not designated as criminals? The key lies in the word designated. They are criminals in that they commit crimes against life and liveliness, but except in rare instances, such as the case of a Hitler, when they might achieve extraordinary degrees of political power that remove them from ordinary restraints, their crimes are so subtle and covert that they cannot clearly be designated as crimes. The theme of hiding and covertness will occur again and again throughout the rest of the book. It is the basis for the title, People of the Lie. I have spent a good deal of time working in prisons with designated criminals. Almost never have I experienced them as evil people. Obviously, they are destructive, and usually repetitively so, but there is a kind of randomness to their destructiveness. Moreover, although to the authorities they generally deny responsibility for their evil deeds, there is still a quality of openness to their wickedness. They themselves are quick to point this out, claiming that they have been caught precisely because they are the honest criminals. The truly evil, they will tell you, always reside outside of jail. Clearly, these proclamations are self-justifying. They are also, I believe, generally accurate. People in jail can almost always be assigned a standard psychiatric diagnosis of one kind or another. The diagnoses range all over the map and correspond in layman's terms to such qualities as craziness or impulsiveness or aggressiveness or lack of conscience. The men and women I shall be talking about, such as Bobby's parents, have no such obvious defects and do not fall clearly into our routine psychiatric pigeonholes. This is not because the evil are healthy. It is simply because we have not yet developed a definition for their disease. Since I distinguish between evil people and ordinary criminals, I also obviously make the distinction between evil as a personality characteristic and evil deeds. In other words, evil deeds do not an evil person make. Otherwise, we should all be evil because we all do evil things. Sinning is most broadly defined as missing the mark. This means that we sin every time we fail to hit the bullseye. Sin is nothing more and nothing less than a failure to be continually perfect. Because it is impossible for us to be continually perfect, we are all sinners. We routinely fail to do the very best of which we are capable, and with each failure, we commit a crime of sorts against God, our neighbours, or ourselves, if not frankly against the law. Of course, there are crimes of greater and lesser magnitude. It is a mistake, however, to think of sin or evil as a matter of degree. It may seem less odious to cheat the rich than the poor, but it is still cheating. There are differences before the law between defrauding a business, claiming a false deduction on your income tax, using a crib sheet in an examination, telling your wife that you have work when you are unfaithful, or telling your husband or yourself that you didn't have time to pick up his clothes at the cleaner when you spent an hour on the phone with your neighbour. Surely one is more excusable than the other, and perhaps all the more so under circumstances. But the facts remains that they are all lies and betrayals. If you are sufficiently scrupulous not to have done any such thing recently, then ask whether there is any way in which you have lied to yourself, or have kidded yourself, or have been less than you could be, which is a self-betrayal. Be perfectly honest with yourself, and you will realize that you win. No, and you will realize that you sin. If you do not realize it, then you are not perfectly honest with yourself, which is itself a sin. It is inescapable. We are all sinners. There is a note there, and I'll read the notes either on the end or the next video. If evil people cannot be defined by the illegality of their deeds or the magnitude of their sins, then how are we to define them? The answer is by the consistency of their sins. While usually subtle, their destructiveness is remarkably consistent. This is because those who have crossed over the line are characterized by their absolute refusal to tolerate the sense of their own sinfulness. I commented that George, blessed by guilt, managed to turn away from becoming evil because he was willing, at least to a rudimentary degree, to tolerate the sense of his own sinfulness. He was able to reject his pact with the devil. Had he not borne the pain of the guilties he experienced over the pact, his moral deterioration would have continued. More than anything else, it is the sense of our own sinfulness that prevents any of us from undergoing a similar deterioration, as I have written elsewhere. Blessed are the poor in spirit, Jesus began when the time came for him to address the multitudes. What did he mean by this opener? What is so great about feeling down on yourself, about having this sense of personal sin? If you ask that, it might help to remember the Pharisees. They were the fat cats of Jesus' day. They didn't feel poor in spirit. They felt they had it all together. That they were the ones who knew the score, who deserved to be the culture leaders in Jerusalem and Palestine, and they were the ones who murdered Jesus. The poor in spirit do not commit evil. Evil is not committed by people who feel uncertain about their righteousness, who question their own motives, who worry about betraying themselves. The evil in this world is committed by the spiritual fat cats, by the Pharisees of our own day, the self-righteous who think they are without sin because they are unwilling to suffer the discomfort of significant self-examination. Unpleasant though it may be, the sense of personal sin is precisely that which keeps our sin from getting out of hand. It is quite painful at times, but it is a very great blessing because it is our one and only effective safeguard against our own proclivity for evil. Saint Therese of Lisieux put it so nicely in her gentle way. If you are willing to serenely bear the trial of being displeasing to yourself, then you will be for Jesus a pleasant place of shelter. The evil do not serenely bear the trial of being displeasing to themselves. In fact, they don't bear it at all. I could not, for instance, detect a hint of self-recrimination in Bobby's parents, and it is out of their failure to put themselves on trial that their evil arises. The varieties of people's wickedness are manifold. As a result of their refusal to tolerate the sense of their own sinfulness, the evil ones become uncorrectable grab bags of sin. They are, for instance, in my experience, remarkably greedy people. First, they are cheap, so cheap that their gifts may be murderous. In The Road Less Travelled, I suggested the most basic sin is laziness. In the next subsection, I suggest it may be pride, because all sins are repairable except the sin of believing one is without sin. But perhaps the question of which sin is the greatest is, on a certain level, a moot issue. All sins betray and isolate us from both the divine and our fellow creatures. As one deep religious thinker put it, Any sin can harden into hell. There can be a state of soul against which love itself is powerless because it has hardened itself against love. Hell is essentially a state of being which we fashion for ourselves, a state of final separateness from God, which is the result not of God's repudiation of man, but of man's repudiation of God, and a repudiation which is eternal precisely because it has become in itself immovable. There are analogies in human experience. The hate which is so blind, so dark, that love only makes it the more violent. The pride which is so stony that humility only makes it more scornful. The inertia, last but not least, the inertia, which has so taken possession of the personality that no crisis, no appeal, no inducement whatsoever can stir it into activity, but on the contrary makes it bury itself the more deeply in its immobility. So with the soul and God, pride can become hardened into hell. Hatred can become hardened into hell. Any of the 7 root forms of wrongdoing can harden into hell, and not least that sloth, which is boredom with divine things, the inertia that cannot be troubled to repent, even though it sees the abyss into which the soul is falling. Because for so long, in little ways perhaps, it has accustomed itself to refuse whatever might cost it an effort. May God in His mercy save us from that. Hallelujah. A predominant characteristic, however, of the behaviour of those I call evil is scapegoating, because in their hearts they consider themselves above reproach. They must lash out at anyone who does reproach them. They sacrifice others to preserve their self-image of perfection. Take a simple example of a 6-year-old boy who asks his father, "Daddy, why did you call Grandmummy a bitch?" "I told you to stop bothering me," the father roars. "Now you're going to get it. I'm going to teach you not to use such filthy language. I'm going to wash your mouth out with soap. Maybe that will teach you to clean up what you say and keep your mouth shut when you're told." Dragging the boy upstairs to the soap dish, the father inflicts this punishment on him. In the name of proper discipline, evil has been committed. Scapegoating works through a mechanism psychiatrists call projection. Since the evil, deep down, feel themselves to be faultless, it is inevitable that when they are in conflict with the world, they will invariably perceive the conflict as the world's fault. Since they must deny their own badness, they must perceive others as bad. They project their own evil onto the world. They never think of themselves as evil. On the other hand, they consequently see much evil in others. The father perceived the profanity and uncleanliness as existing in his son and took action to cleanse his son's filthiness. Yet we know it was the father who was profane and unclean. The father projected his own filth onto his son and then assaulted his son in the name of good parenting. Evil, then, is most often committed in order to scapegoat, and the people I label as evil are chronic scapegoaters. In The Road Less Travelled, I defined evil as the exercise of political power, that is, the imposition of one's will upon others by overt or covert coercion, in order to avoid spiritual growth. In other words, the evil attack others instead of facing their own failures. Spiritual growth requires the acknowledgement of one's need to grow. If we cannot make that acknowledgement, we have no option except to attempt to eradicate the evidence of our imperfection. There's a note there for afters. Strangely enough, evil people are often destructive because they are attempting to destroy evil. The problem is that they misplace the locus of the evil. Instead of destroying others, they should be destroying the sickness within themselves. As life often threatens their self-image of perfection, they are often busily engaged in hating and destroying that life, usually in the name of righteousness. The fault, however, may not be so much that they hate life as that they do not hate the sinful part of themselves. I doubt that Bobby's parents deliberately wanted to kill Stuart or him. I suspect if I had gotten to know them well enough, I would have found their murderous behaviour totally dictated by an extreme form of self-protectiveness, which invariably sacrificed others rather than themselves. What is the cause of this failure of self-hatred, this failure to be displeasing to oneself, which seems to be the central sin at the root of the scapegoating behaviour of those I call evil? The cause is not, I believe, an absent conscience. There are people, both in and out of jail, who seem utterly lacking in conscience or superego. Psychiatrists call them psychopaths or sociopaths. Guiltless, they not only commit crimes, but may often do so with a kind of reckless abandon. There is little pattern or meaning to their criminality. It is not particularly characterised by scapegoating. Conscienceless, psychopaths appear to be bothered or worried by very little, including their own criminality. They seem to be about as happy inside a jail as out. They do attempt to hide their crimes, but their efforts to do so are often feeble and careless and poorly planned. They have sometimes been referred to as moral imbeciles, and there is almost a quality of innocence to their lack of worry and concern. This is hardly the case with those I call evil, utterly dedicated to preserving their self-image of perfection. They are unceasingly engaged in the effort to maintain the appearance of moral purity. They worry about this a great deal. They are acutely sensitive to social norms and what others might think of them. Like Bobby's parents, they dress well, go to work on time, pay their taxes, and outwardly seem to live lives that are above reproach. The words image, appearance, and outwardly are crucial to understanding the morality of evil. While they seem to lack any motivation to be good, they intensely desire to appear good. Their goodness is all on a level of pretense. It is, in effect, a lie. This is why they are the people of the lie. Page 84. Actually, the lie is designed not so much to deceive others as to deceive themselves. They cannot or will not tolerate the pain of self-reproach. The decorum with which they lead their lives is maintained as a mirror in which they can see themselves reflected righteously. Yet the self-deficit would be unnecessary if the evil had no sense of right and wrong. We lie only when we are attempting to cover up something we know to be illicit. Some rudimentary form of conscience must precede the act of lying. There is no need to hide unless we first feel that something needs to be hidden. We come now to a sort of paradox. I have said that evil people feel themselves to be perfect. A paradox is when, like, if you've got two things that are completely opposite, but they are also exactly the same. And it's also true, but not true. And that is a paradox. We come now to a sort of a paradox. I have said that evil people feel themselves to be perfect. At the same time, however, I think they have an unacknowledged sense of their own evil nature. Indeed, it is this very sense from which they are frantically trying to flee. The essential component of evil is not the absence of a sense of sin or imperfection, but the unwillingness to tolerate that sense. At one and the same time, the evil are aware of their evil and desperately trying to avoid the awareness. Rather than blissfully lacking a sense of morality like the psychopath, they are continually engaged in sweeping the evidence of their evil under the rug of their own consciousness. For everything they did, Bobby's parents had a rationalisation, a whitewash, good enough for themselves, even if not for me. The problem is not a defect of conscience, but the effort to deny the conscience its due. We become evil by attempting to hide from ourselves. The wickedness of the evil is not committed directly, but indirectly, as a part of this cover-up process. Evil originates not in the absence of guilt, but in the effort to escape it. It often happens, then, that the evil may be recognised by its very disguise. The lie can be perceived before the misdeed it is designed to hide. The cover-up before the fact. We see the smile that hides the hatred. the smooth and oily manner that masks the fury, the velvet glove that covers the feast. Because they are such experts at disguise, it is seldom possible to pinpoint the maliciousness of the evil. The disguise is usually impenetrable, but what we can catch are glimpses of the uncanny game of hide and seek in the obscurity of the soul, in which it, the single human soul, evades itself, avoids itself, hides from itself. There's a note on that one. In The Road Less Travelled, I suggested that laziness or the desire to escape legitimate suffering lies at the root of all mental illness. Here we are also talking about avoidance and evasion of pain. What distinguishes the evil, however, from the rest of us mentally ill sinners is a specific type of pain they are running away from. They are not pain avoiders or lazy people in general. To the contrary, they are likely to exert themselves more than most in their continuing effort to obtain and maintain an image of high respectability. They may willingly, even eagerly, undergo great hardships in their search for status. It is only one particular kind of pain they cannot tolerate: the pain of their own conscience, the pain of the realization of their own sinfulness and imperfection. Since they will do almost anything to avoid the particular pain that comes from self-examination, under ordinary circumstances, the evil are the last people who would ever come to psychotherapy. The evil hate the light of goodness that shows them up, the light of scrutiny that exposes them, the light of truth that penetrates their deception. Psychotherapy is a light-shedding process par excellence. Except for the most twisted motives, an evil person would be more likely to choose any other conceivable route than the psychiatrist's couch. The submission to the discipline of self-observation required by psychoanalysis does in fact seem to them like suicide. The most significant reason we know so little scientifically about human evil is simply that the evil are so extremely reluctant to be studied. If the central defect of the evil is not one of conscience, then where does it reside? The essential psychological problems of human evil, I believe, is a particular variety of narcissism. Right, that's the end of that section called... so that was called Evil and Sin, part of chapter 2, Towards the Psychology of Evil. The next section is called Narcissism and Will, and that will be the final part of chapter 2. So, Narcissism and Will. Narcissism, or self-absorption, takes many forms. Some are normal in childhood but not in adulthood. Some are more distinctly pathological than others. The subject is as complex as it is important. It is not the purpose of this book, however, to give a balanced view of the whole topic, so we will proceed immediately to that particular pathologic variant that Eric Fromm called malignant narcissism. Malignant narcissism is characterized by an unsubmitted will. All adults who are mentally healthy submit themselves one way or another to something higher than themselves, be it God or truth or love or some other ideal. They do what God wants them to do rather than what they would desire. Thy will, not mine, be done, the God-submitted person says. They believe in what is true rather than what they would like to believe. They believe in what is true rather than what they would like to be true. Unlike Bobby's parents, what their beloved needs becomes more important to them than their own gratification. In summary, to a greater or lesser degree, all mentally healthy individuals submit themselves to the demands of their own conscience. Not so the evil. However, in the conflict between their guilt and their will, it is the guilt that must go and the will that must win. The reader will be struck by the extraordinary willfulness of evil people. They are men and women of obviously strong will, determined to have their own way. There is a remarkable power in the manner in which they attempt to control others. There's a note there. That was page 87. Theologians speak of evil being a consequence of free will. When God, creating us in his own image, gave us free will, he had to allow us humans the option of evil. The problem can also be envisioned in the secular terms of evolution theory. The will of less evolved creatures seems largely under the control of their instincts. When humans evolved from the apes, however, they largely evolved out from under such instinctual controls and hence into free will. This evolution leaves humans in the position of being either totally willful or having to seek new ways of self-control through submission to higher principles. But this still leaves us with the question of why some human beings are able to achieve such submission while others are not. Indeed, it is almost tempting to think that the problem of evil lies in the will itself. Perhaps the evil are born so inherently strong-willed that it is impossible for them ever to submit their will. Yet I think it is characteristic of all great people that they are extremely strong-willed, whether their greatness be for good or for evil. The strong will, the power and authority of Jesus radiates from the Gospels, just as Hitler's did from Mein Kampf. But Jesus' will was that of his father, and Hitler's that of his own. The crucial distinction is between willingness and willfulness. The willful failure of submission that characterizes malignant narcissism is depicted in both the stories of Satan and of Cain and Abel. Satan refused to submit to God's judgment that Christ was superior to him. For Christ to be preferred meant that Satan was not. Satan was less than Christ in God's eyes. For Satan to have accepted God's judgment, he would have had to accept his own imperfection. This he could not or would not do. It was unthinkable that he was imperfect. Consequently, submission was impossible, and both the rebellion and fall inevitable. So also, God's acceptance of Abel's sacrifice implied a criticism of Cain. Cain was less than Abel in God's eyes. Since he refused to acknowledge his imperfection, it was inevitable that Cain, like Satan, should take the law into his own hands and commit murder. In some similar, although usually more subtle fashion, all who are evil also take the law into their own hands, to destroy life or liveliness in defense of their narcissistic self-image. Pride goeth before the fall, it is said, and of course laymen simply call pride what we have labelled with the fancy psychiatric term of malignant narcissism. Being at the very root of evil, it is no accident that church authorities have generally considered pride first among the sins. By the sin of pride, they do not generally mean the sense of legitimate achievement one might enjoy after a job well done. While such pride, like normal narcissism, may have its pitfalls, it is also part of healthy self-confidence and a realistic sense of self-worth. What is meant is rather a kind of pride that unrealistically denies our inherent sinfulness and imperfection, a kind of overweening pride or arrogance that prompts people to reject and even attack the judgment implied by the day-to-day evidence of their own inadequacy. Despite its fruits, Bobby's parents saw no fault in their childcare. In Buber's words, the malignantly narcissistic insist upon affirmation independent of all findings. What is the cause of this overweening pride, this arrogant self-image of perfection, this particularly malignant type of narcissism? Why does it afflict a few when most seem to escape its clutches? We do not know. In the past 15 years, psychiatrists have begun to pay increasing attention to the phenomenon of narcissism, but our understanding of the subject is still in its infancy. We have not yet succeeded, for instance, in distinguishing the different types of excessive self-absorption. I have to stop there. Thanks for listening.